Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Amol Rajan. Now, there is only one story we're looking at today, and of course that is the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower in Kensington, West London, that has claimed the lives of scores of victims and shaken the capital to its very core. How could this be allowed to happen? Who is to blame? And what needs to be done to help rebuild this shattered community and ensure that this never happens again? Well, joining me to help answer some of those questions in the studio, Emma Dent-Coad, who only 10 days ago won her seat to become the new Labour Member of Parliament for Kensington. Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst, Bob Neill, who served as a Minister for Fire from 2010 to 2012 in the Cameron-led coalition government, and Jim Fitzpatrick, Labour MP for Poplar and Limehouse, himself a former fireman for 20 years and who has also served as Minister for London. Welcome to all of you. Emma, let me start with you and just get your reaction to this horrific tragedy.
It's absolutely terrifying, and the worst thing really for most of us is that this was clearly predicted, and there've been concerns flagged up for many years by residents living there. You know, as far as we can see, it was preventable, and that adds a whole new layer of horror to the whole event.
Jim, you were a fireman for 20-odd years. As a fireman, you can go through endless training schedules and training programmes, but I suppose nothing would prepare you for this kind of event.
No, and the best comment this week on that was from Danny Cotton, who's acting interim commissioner of the fire service. She said in her 29 years operational experience, she's never seen anything like it. This is entirely singular, so it must have been absolutely shocking for the firefighters turning up, and I can't imagine what it was like for the victims inside.
Well, what's your reaction to the news?
Well, that's right. This is first of all, above everything, this is an appalling human tragedy, and we've got to reach out to the people who've suffered, both who've lost family and who've lost possessions. But Jim is also right to say thank heavens for the professionalism of the fire service and the bravery. I think Danny Cotton and her team responded brilliantly well to what must be, for them, an extraordinary set of events to have to confront.
Indeed, but there are huge questions about, as you say, Emma, whether or not this was preventable and what was done in the years gone by to try and stop this kind of thing happening. Jim, you were Fire Minister from 2005 to 2006. Why didn't you ban plastic-filled cladding?
I don't know the answer to that question. They will obviously be asked by the inquiry that's been set up. Everybody who has had any role at any level in local government or central government, be it an elected politician or be it a professional civil servant or expert, we're going to be scrutinised, and these questions will be asked and answers will have to be given.
But there was lots. I mean, in 2000, the House of Commons very specifically wrote a report saying that this particular type of cladding should be banned. So there had been warnings. I mean, do you recall from your time, I know it's going back over a decade, but do you recall from your time concerns being raised about this kind of cladding, which seems to have been absolutely central to the spreading of the fire at Grenfell?
I don't recall, as you say, it is over 10 years ago, but there will be records. There will be details of all the decisions that I took, and that will be open to complete scrutiny. What people want are answers to these questions, and they will be asked and answers will be given, and then people will be able to draw conclusions as to culpability and responsibility.
Well, we're seeing some of the horrific pictures, obviously charred black on the outside. There is a widely accepted idea that the cladding on the outside, which was filled with plastic, is one of the reasons the fire spread so fast and gave us that appearance. Bob, you were also Minister for Fire, 2010 to 2012. That came after the Lakanal House tragedy in South London, where 6 people died in 2009. What changed as a result of the Lakanal House fire under your watch as Minister for Fire?
Well, what happened during my watch was that we cooperated with the inquest and I made sure that my chief fire advisor gave evidence to the inquest. The inquest reported after I'd left government, but I do know that my successor then wrote to all social housing providers and local authorities drawing attention to the inquest's findings, and also guidance was issued in 2014 on fighting fires in high-rise buildings.
Well, plastic-filled cladding was banned in Germany in the 1980s. Do you remember from your time there people saying, actually, this is one of the most appalling hazards and something should be done about it?
There certainly was always discussion about changing technology in building. This is one of the interesting things, that types of cladding change really quite rapidly sometimes, and so you do constantly need to be getting technical guidance to update the regulations. And it may well be, Jim's absolutely right, it's one of the things that the public inquiry is going to have to look at. Not only were the regulations adequate, but also was the work done in accordance with existing regulations? We can't be certain of that yet either.
Well, Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, kept mentioning the public inquiry on the Andrew Marr show, but of course the public inquiry is going to take some time to answer, isn't it? Or to find the evidence that, of what happened here, and we want answers before then. I mean, in 2009, after the Lakanal House fire, the coroner said it is recommended that the Department for Communities and Local Government encourage providers of housing in high-rise residential buildings containing multiple domestic premises to consider the retrofitting of sprinkler systems. Do you remember anyone ever coming to you and saying, as Minister for Fire, that we should retrofit blocks, tower blocks like Grenfell with sprinkler systems?
As I said, the recommendation from the coroner came after I'd left office, but my successor, I know, did write, drawing specifically that recommendation to the attention of all local authorities and social housing providers. But the thing about the inquest is this, and the inquiry is this: the government have made it clear that we want an interim report quickly, because people do need answers. That's the most natural thing in the world. That's only fair. So we need a detailed inquiry, but I think we should be able to get an interim report answering some of those immediate questions as soon as possible.
Emma, does that satisfy you?
Not entirely, no, frankly. I've written a letter to Amber Rudd yesterday, which is widely available, and we've made a number of points that we need to be addressed.
Such as?
Well, they're all here in my letter. There's certain issues about dealing with the survivors now, and how they're to be housed and how they're to be looked after, and help must be available 24/7. Well, I heard just this morning, we're still hearing stories of people not being allocated properly. There's one woman this morning and her child. They've been moved 3 times since Wednesday into different accommodation. That's absolutely appalling.
Well, I tell you what, we're going to come on to the political response and whether or not it was adequate a bit later on. But let's just talk about safety and what could or couldn't have been done before this horrendous thing happened. Now, you were on the Housing Scrutiny Committee of Kensington and Chelsea. You were a long-term councillor there before you became an MP. Did anyone ever raise with you the issue of sprinkler safety?
I've never heard that being discussed in relation. I mean, there is a claim that it was offered to the residents of Grenfell Tower and that they refused it. And I've spoken to the residents of Grenfell Tower and they said it was never refused. The issue about Grenfell Tower, when I was on the board of the TMO, which I left in 2012, was that it was in a very bad condition, that the heating and hot water was constantly failing, people were concerned about the electric cabling, and the windows were leaking and it needed a refit. So to a certain extent, the refurbishment was welcomed. To a certain extent, but you know how that was done was decided after me. And let me just explain. You know, the committee system on the council, it's a scrutiny system. We don't make the decisions. The decision making is not with. And as a minority party councillor, you can ask all the questions you like. If there is a vote, which there is very rarely, it isn't in our hands.
Of course.
It's the cabinet member who signs it off. He has to be completely content that.
And you're not actually in charge of implementing the policies. I understand that.
Yeah.
Jim, is it acceptable that only 1% of tower blocks have sprinklers fitted? When we know from the Fire Brigades Union that no one has ever died in Britain in a tower block that was properly fitted with a sprinkler system.
Well, sprinklers are a very effective way of controlling fires and mostly extinguishing fires, certainly preventing them from spreading and allowing the fire brigade time to turn up, which is why sprinklers are an attractive option. But of course, the media's concentrated a lot on sprinklers and the firefighters' response and praising all of that. That's the tip of the iceberg. This all goes back to the building regulations, the appropriate specification of materials, the quality of work that's undertaken, the inspection of the work once it's completed to make sure it passes muster, then the maintenance of the building to make sure, and Emma's just been raising that, maintenance and the inspection of the buildings. If that's all done properly, you don't get to a fire. And if you don't get to a fire, you don't need sprinklers, and the firefighters can spend their time going round and educating people about fire, fitting smoke detectors in vulnerable people's homes, and making sure that people are aware of the dangers. So sprinklers are important, and sprinklers do save lives, and we should have more deployment of sprinklers, and I'm absolutely positive it will be one of the major recommendations of this committee of inquiry that sprinklers should be more deployed.
People want answers as to why the sprinklers weren't there in the first place. Bob Neal, your successor as Communities Local Government Minister, Brandon Lewis, said in 2014, "We believe that it is the responsibility of the fire industry rather than the government to market fire sprinkler systems effectively and to encourage their wider installation. The cost of fitting a fire sprinkler system may affect house building, something we want to encourage. So we must wait to see what impact that regulation has." Does that now strike you as an appalling abdication of responsibility?
Now, I think it was a reasonable proposition to say that we need to get sprinklers delivered effectively
What,
and
to say
efficiently.
that, sorry, forgive me, to say that it's a responsibility of the fire industry rather than the government to market sprinkler systems possibly, coming after a tragedy in 2009, which was followed by a coroner's report, which, as you say, afterwards concluded that sprinklers should be installed retrofitted everywhere.
Well, certainly it's the responsibility of government to set the regulations and the safety standards. The products are produced inevitably by the private sector. I think that's the point that Brandon was making. But we do need to make sure that those products are available. Jim's right, it's quite a complex matter. Sprinklers do have a great role to play. They don't necessarily answer every problem, and that's why we need to have, in this inquiry, to find out exactly what's happened, back to the root cause.
But we don't need the inquiry to report before we get a sense of whether or not it's and an answer from you as to whether or not it's the government's responsibility to make sure sprinklers are retrofitted all over the place. I mean, Brandon Lewis's quote from 2014 is saying that it's the responsibility of the fire industry rather than the government. I mean, do you have a view on whether or not it's actually the duty of the government to make sure that sprinklers are properly fitted?
Actually, what the government did was to draw the attention of the coroner's recommendation very specifically to every provider of social housing across the country, and actually they have the ability to fit those sprinklers if they wish to do so. Now, we will need to consider, do we need to revisit the strength of that guidance? That's very properly something that that needs to be done as a result of the public inquiry.
All right, well, let me stop you all there for a moment because I want to get another take on this. On Friday, our reporter Tanjil Rashid asked David Lammy, who's the Labour MP for Tottenham, about the loss of a close personal friend in the fire.
It makes me feel angry. Khadija and her family remind me of my family in the 70s. Poor, working class, to some extent vulnerable in relation to power. You've heard that the residents were complaining to the TMO and their complaints were falling on deaf ears. We have got to reassess the truth of what it means to be living in social housing, how hard it is to get any remedy when things go wrong, the conditions in which you live.
Do you think we need to end social housing in tower blocks? Is that something that needs to change?
Of course, there are tower blocks in London for the very wealthy. They have external fire escapes as well as internal ones. They have sprinkler systems. They have many lifts. There are many ways to get out. Unless you are prepared to bring public housing up to that standard, then it seems to me that we need to move away from those 70s tower blocks. We need to demolish them, and we need to house people in different circumstances in the city. After almost a decade of austerity in this country, we need to bring the state back. I'm not sure that we want arm's-length organisations that don't take responsibility for the people who live in their buildings, who don't take their concerns seriously, who don't understand what it means if the lift breaks down and you've got to get 22 floors up to the top, who don't understand what it's like living if the stairwells are occupied by drug addicts during the evening or during the course of the day, where there are no fire hoses, where there are no alarms, where there are no sprinklers, where apparently fire doors are taken out but not put back in. That is not acceptable. Why does it take a fire to wake us up to the reality of what's happening in this city?
David Lammy MP for Tottenham speaking to our reporter Tanjil Rashid there. Emma Dent-Code, why are there different safety standards for the rich?
Well, there certainly shouldn't be. What we're hearing right now is the difference between guidance and regulation. You know, the regulations have been pulled back, and this, you know, this idea that, well, we've got to get rid of the red tape, and so there's guidance. It should be imposed, and actually the standards should be the same. Maintenance of council and housing association homes over the years has been deteriorating. I've seen that. We're back to, you know, really appalling conditions that some people are living in, and they're not safe. And that's down to maintenance and the funding for the maintenance as well.
Do you agree with David Lammy that all tower blocks that don't have appropriate sprinklers fitted and safety regulations in place should be abolished and the residents should be rehoused?
I don't actually, and most of my career I spent as a architecture historian and critic, and a lot of my friends have been writing to me, some of them who built similar tower blocks in the past. If they're properly maintained, I mean, they're actually built to contain fire within each unit. We had a fire in Trellick Tower just 3 months ago, and it was contained within a unit. There was some smoke damage, but you could see it was completely contained. That's how it should be. If the fire breaks are there, if it's properly maintained, if there are fire doors on the front doors, those concrete frame buildings are incredibly safe, but they must be maintained properly. And if they do refurbishments, they have to restore fire breaks. They are actually safe if they're maintained properly. So why aren't we maintaining our social housing to the same level as private housing?
Well, perhaps the issue is who's in charge. Jim, you spent many years as a government minister in the Labour years, 20 years as a fireman before that. We seem to have a situation here, don't we, where you have ministers who are in charge of regulations, councillors who are funding an arm's-length management company, and then a management company paying the cheapest bidder for a refurb. Isn't the whole system designed to make it easy for people to pass the buck?
Well, that's one way of looking at it, but Emma makes a very strong point. If the regulations are in place, if the law is there, and if it's enforced, then people don't get the chance to pass the buck. One of the strongest recommendations of the Lucknow House Inquiry was a review of building regulations, because as Bob said, we see new methods of construction being developed all the time, we see new materials being used, we see other countries banning particular materials. We have to keep up with this. If we don't keep up with it, we fall behind at our peril.
But so who should take responsibility? I hear both of you loud and clear that regulation matters. I'm asking you who should take responsibility, because a lot of people who are very angry about this tragedy, who are protesting on the streets, who called the Prime Minister a coward when she tried to make a visit to the site, are saying no one is taking responsibility. You've been a fire minister. Who should take responsibility for the safety of tower blocks like Grenfell, of which we know there are many others around the country?
Ultimately, we as parliamentarians do, the government does, ministers do. It is a government job to level and lay regulations which then have to be enforced. So the buck stops with government, it stops with Parliament. We all have a responsibility in that regard. In terms of fires, the people who die in fires historically have always been the poor, the old, the sick, the disabled, people with addiction difficulties, people who have difficulty getting out. And again, Emma's point, the accommodation provided for them, if it's up to the appropriate standard, they are safe in that accommodation. We can improve safety all the time, but we need to make sure that the basics are there to protect people in their own homes. It failed in Grenfell Tower. The inquiry will demonstrate how the fire started. Remember, we've had a big scandal in London recently with white goods exploding, the fire in Hammersmith, and a number of those across the country. Manufacturers have a responsibility to recall goods which are not fit for purpose as well. There is a whole host of issues which have to be looked at. We could do a much better job at protecting people.
Well, hopefully the inquiry will point to some of that stuff. You mentioned the political response, Jim. Let's turn to that now. Bob Neal, MP, has Theresa May's response been good enough?
I think Theresa herself accepted that the government's overall response needed to be improved, and that's why we set up the task force.
What do you think about Theresa May's response to this? Theresa May visiting the site, she was widely criticised. We're seeing her on screen at the moment. She was widely criticised for not speaking to more of the victims and their victims' families and speaking only to servicemen. She has subsequently seen them in Downing Street. She then went on Newsnight and spoke to Emily Maitlis, where she was required to show she understood and was empathetic toward the suffering of people. And she's been roundly condemned in today's papers, including by the Tory-supporting papers. So I'm asking you, has Theresa May's response been good enough?
I think she's done the workmanlike thing. She's not one of those people, perhaps, who shows emotion as openly as some of us do.
Don't you need to if you're Prime Minister?
Well,
don't you need to show an understanding?
In a media world, sometimes you do need to. But what she did do was see her as she went there. I am aware that she had particular security advice as to whether or not it was entirely helpful for a Prime Minister to a visit to the scene immediately. But she sat down with people, and I've seen her sit down with people in difficult situations, one-to-one, in groups like she did in Downing Street, and she is a woman who cares. The key thing now is to get this package of help that we set up delivered for people.
Of course, but there is a question, isn't there, about the Prime Minister's authority. She just called a snap election. The snap election resulted in a hung Parliament. You're an influential Tory MP, you're a soft Brexit man, you're a Remainer, as the Prime Minister was initially. Do you think that her response to Grenfell Tower has further damaged and undermined the Prime Minister's authority?
I don't believe it need do so. I think the key
Has it done so far, though?
I think some people are making some political capital out of it. I want to get on with the job of government. The people who suffered in Grenfell Tower need that. They don't need speculation in newspapers. What we need is the government getting on with its job on this particular tragic issue, but also on the key issues about the main issues that confront the government as a whole.
Emma Dent-Coad, isn't Bob Neal right to say that what we should be doing is focusing on helping the people who need most help and not politicising this issue?
Well, politics or not, people want justice. So that's the main issue. People actually want, I'm sorry, no waffle. They actually want straight talking. They're not children. They want to be talked to as responsible human beings, and they're constantly being talked down to and have been for years, and their concerns completely ignored at Grenfell Tower. The very thing that happened, the very chain of events that happened was predicted. That's horrendous, and they were ignored, infantilised and not listened to, and I won't have people talking down to the people who elected me.
Well, let's see what Sajid Javid, the Community Secretary, had to say about this week.
We will do whatever it takes. We will take the expert advice, do whatever it takes to make those buildings safe or make those people safe. Whatever it takes. We have to be led by the experts, but there can be no shortcuts to this.
Jim Fitzpatrick, are you seriously asserting that Tory austerity, as some other people on the left of politics have done, Tory austerity is somehow to blame for this awful human tragedy?
I haven't said that, but what is clearly worth examining, and I'm sure the inquiry will look at it, is whether or not, again going back to our fundamental point about the maintenance of these buildings, about the appropriate skills being deployed by the workers who've been doing the construction, the right materials being purchased that's up to the right specification. All of these things will have to be looked at. There's a report in, I think it's the Sunday Mirror this morning, that the number of inspections in tower blocks carried out by the fire service is down 25% between 2010 and 2017. So why has that been happening when the risk is as great, if not greater, because there are more people in the country? So there'll be questions which have to be answered. Whether or not it has had a direct effect, that will be for the inquiry to determine.
Emma, briefly, if you would.
This particular issue is very little to do with austerity. Kensington and Chelsea Council has nearly £300 million in reserves, which I've commented on regularly over the years and criticised them for not spending it where it could actually do the best work. They haven't done that. We have austerity across the country. We have some in Kensington and Chelsea. The council has been squirreling money away and not spending it where it would be best used.
Bob Neal, after the financial crash, we spent billions bailing out bankers. Isn't the brutal lesson of this week that actually we don't care so much when it's poor people who are suffering?
No, I don't think that is the case. What we do need to learn from this is that it's not just enough to put in place the laws and regulations to a proper standard. We must have them enforced properly, and that does have to be done regardless of where people live and regardless of their circumstances. That's an important point that we need to get from this inquiry. And the important point about that is I'm glad to see that the government has said that it will pay for legal representation for the victims' families of Grenfell Towers, so that they have their say in that inquiry and that they will have a say in the scoping of the inquiry itself. So we've got to get the fact that it isn't always as easy for everybody to get their voice across.
We've got to leave it there.
We've got to try and help.
Guys, thank you very much indeed. That's all we have time for. My thanks to Emma Dent-Coad, to Bob Neal and to Jim Fitzpatrick.